We're live.
Hello, everyone. We are live, and welcome to episode 17 of the TechForge podcast. As always, am your host, Dynamo Ned. You can just call me Ned, though. And I'm joined, as ever, by my faithful co-hosts, Jason and Hunter.
Hey!
I might look disembodied voice because my webcam just died. I've been unplugging and plugging into a different USB port, so get to see a awesome Protoss Dark Templar legs.
I always thought you were a Protoss Dark Templar.
Awesome, because I liked it.
We need more pylons.
I got your pylons.
All right. Well, we do have some follow-up news from some of the stuff we discussed last week, including those commissioned benchmarks that Intel got from Principled Technologies. We have some rumors about upcoming AMD GPUs. A fact about a new AMD GPU that unfortunately is not so great. And, of course, the big bit of tech news this week, and that is the release and launch of the NVIDIA RTX 2070. Does it make sense in the current product stack? But let's get started with that little bit of follow-up from last week where we were talking about the Intel commissioned benchmarks from Principled Technologies. In case you weren't watching last week, Intel commissioned a set of benchmarks for its new Core i9-9900K processor against some of its previous generation parts, as well as AMD's 2700X and 2950X and 2990WX Threadripper chips. And the results were called out by several members of the tech press, including most loudly by Steve from Gamers Nexus and a different Steve from Hardware Unboxed. After having the inconsistencies in Principled Technologies test pointed out, they did retest, and well, the results are exactly what we expected. So this first article that I will include links to down below in the description of this video when it goes live is from Kit Guru, where they talk about the new retested Core i9-9900K comparisons show that AMD's Ryzen 7 2700X tested correctly, only 12% slower.
Yep, and it's not that bad. That's a surprise. I still don't think they tested correctly. I bet actual honest reviews will show that to be different.
Well, even if the new testing methodology that PT used is in fact correct, a 12% difference certainly does not put the 9900K in the same light as the previous 50% difference.
Yeah.
Particularly given the 9900K is having a wholesale price of $488 US and is typically found online for between $520 and $550 at the outlets where you can actually purchase it, where it isn't sold out.
So I wonder what the percentage of price difference is.
Well, if we look at the 2700X, the 2700X MSRP is currently roughly $330, but you can be found online right now for as low as $290.
I was thinking it was slightly cheaper. That's ballpark.
So we'll call it 300 for the sake of argument. And we'll give Intel the benefit of the doubt as well and say 520 for the 9900K. that's still almost 2/3 more for a 12% increase in performance.
That's just the processor.
Yeah, that's not even counting the fact that the i9 does not come with a boxed cooler. The Ryzen 7 does. The i9 uses a more expensive motherboard and chipset. And, you know, it's basically when Principled Technologies did go back and retest everything, it basically looks like now that, yes, the Core i9 9900K is going to be statistically faster than the Ryzen 7 2700X in gaming benchmarks.
Well, yeah, I don't think anyone disputes that. I think everyone understands that for the most part, it's going to be faster in most workloads. Considering it's eight cores and 12 and 16 threads, but it's at higher clock speeds. And I want to say IPC at the same clock speed is probably at parity or really close. So yeah, I don't think anyone disputes that. It's just a huge difference in platform cost.
Yeah, it's and that's kind of why Intel's response this entire time has felt so tone deaf. Because it's basically been, well, of course, ours is the best gaming processor. That wasn't what anyone was arguing. Even with these renewed tests, ours is still the best gaming processor. Yeah. No one was making the argument it wasn't. It's how much value does the 9900K provide compared to its primary competitor, which costs almost $200 less.
Which I would really argue that you really can't call that a competitor, since they're not priced, in the same ballpark. Price-wise, the 2700X really should be competing against the i7.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess you can kind of say that they compete with each other mainly off of the fact that, they're both the highest performing parts in their product stacks. You know what I mean? But
right.
Yeah, but when you look at dollar segments, like $300, that's even less than the i7. So, I mean, that would compete with the non-K i7. Yeah. And it's unlocked, and you get more threads. I don't know.
Yeah, the 9700K is, because it now no longer has hyper-threading, it's an 8-core, 8-thread chip versus Ryzen at a slightly lower price point. The 2700X is now offering 8-core, 16 threads. And so it just seems like to me the 9700K has become irrelevant. What Intel has done in the attempt to try to one-up Ryzen, and this is just purely me giving my opinion, they have rendered their Core i7s in the mainstream segment irrelevant.
Right. And here's a kicker. The 2700 non-X is priced cheaper than the i5.
Which is a 6-core, 6-thread chip.
No, it's the base 8-core. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. Right. So, yeah.
The entire way Intel has done segmentation for their 9th generation chips is just weird. I kind of understand why they did it, but I think it's really going to hurt them in the long run.
Well, they're pseudo acknowledging Ryzen and the fact that they've added more cores and more threads to their lineup, but then they're not really acknowledging Ryzen in their pricing. So, I mean, you can't really make a value argument for Intel. At least I can't think of one.
The only case I could think of where you could make the value argument for Intel is for those workloads that are specifically tailored to utilize the high frequency of Intel chips. Or if you have a program like, say, MATLAB or Mathematica, where the chips or the compilers and the libraries for those programs have been for so long optimized for Intel,
right,
that in those particular workloads, it's going to work better for Intel.
Or Handbrake. I mean, Handbrake works better on the Core I lineups than the Ryzen, mainly because of the higher clock speed.
Right.
So,
and that's not even taking into account using the fact that that Intel's lineup also is able to use the QuickSync codec.
true. That's a very good point.
And so, I mean, for entry-level content creators, that's something to consider. But if you're really going to be investing into a PC for content production, I'm not sure the 9900K would be my first choice. If I was going to be doing serious content production, I probably would be going for something in the high-end desktop lineup.
Yeah, I would too. At least somewhere around 12 to 16 cores, 24 to 32 threads. You know, it would depend on the budget, but
I was actually talking to one of our TechForge contributors today, and he was looking for advice on how to build his own PC. And the budget he gave kind of made my eyes water a little bit. But
as in too little?
No, far larger than expected.
Oh, okay.
And because he's doing work with MATLAB and Mathematica and with Python libraries and for things that typically have Intel optimized compilers, I said, yeah, in your case, while I think Ryzen is generally the better value, probably an 8700K would better serve you. And of course, there's a whole nother issue there with the fact that he's looking to Hackintosh it, and then that introduces a whole new set of variables.
I don't even want to think about that.
Well, Ryzen can do Hackintosh. Snazzy Labs, Hackintosh.
Yeah, and I saw that video from Snazzy Labs where he was basically able to build a workstation / gaming rig for $1,400 that is roughly equivalent to the $5,000 iMac Pro.
Yeah.
And I kind of used that as a template for this build for this contributor. And I think it'll work out well for him. Whether he decides to Hackintosh it or not, it's a solid system. And yes, I wish that I could recommend Ryzen to him but for his specific use case, Intel does work better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing to keep in mind. There's generalities, and then there's specific use cases.
Right.
Speaking of high clock speeds and specific use cases, all is not bad news for the 9th gen. There was a leak with a video on the Chinese video site Bilibili that showed an overclocker overclocking the Core i5 9600K up to 5.2 gigahertz on air.
It's pretty awesome. Honestly, I would have expected a higher overclock.
Well,
Wonder what kind of cooler they had.
Well, that's what I was getting to. The particular they were working on MSI's Z390 MEG Godlike motherboard.
Oh my gosh.
And apparently they were using a Thermalright Silver Arrow Extreme. Now that's on par with like a Noctua NHD14.
Oh. Thermalright, what was it? Silver Arrow?
Thermalright Silver Arrow Extreme.
My gosh, it's been so long since I've had a Thermalright. I had back in the Athlon days when I had the Barton 2500 overclock, I had a Thermalright heatsink, and then I had a fan attached to the top of it. But it was just a big glob of copper. The massive cooler.
Yeah, Thermalright used to be big in the modding scene in the late 90s, early 2000s. But they kind of slipped out of the U.S. market, though apparently they're big over in Asia still.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, they've got some big... That's a big cooler. Okay.
Yeah, the Silver Arrow Extreme is right up there with like the Noctua NH series when it comes to cooling performance. So...
Well, with this kind of a cooler, I honestly, it's an impressive clock speed, but I think I would have expected more. Like, you know, if you would have said 5.4 gigahertz, I would have been like, all right, wow. But 5.2, I'm just not that impressed because people have been able to delid, you know, 8700K, 8087 and get to 5.2 on air. But those are with really good silicone.
And I'm almost given to think this might have been a bad chip, because to get that 5.2 gigahertz on this 9600K, they had to give it 1.0 or 1.507 volts.
Well, that is pretty similar to the behavior of a delidded Coffee Lake. Because because you can typically get to 5 to 5.1, but then usually when you're going over 5.1, if you're trying to get to 5.2, a lot of times there's a big voltage ceiling there. Like, you can get to it, but you have to pump a lot of volts into it. So,
given that these are basically refreshed Coffee Lake parts for the 9th gen series, that's not terribly surprising. I was kind of hoping the soldered TIM would give us a little bit of extra headroom, but...
Well, it does. It does. I mean, if you're using standard TIM, those parts basically kind of pooped out at like 4.8 to 4.9. Just from heat. Like, you had to have some excessive cooling on there unless you delidded it. So, yeah, you could put a 360A IO or radiator on a i5, but you may not see 5 gigahertz on standard TIM. Then as soon as you delete it, no problem. Yeah.
I was going to say, and even on my old 2600K, if you were willing to put the right kind of cooling on there, you could pretty easily hit, 4.6, 4.7. And that was with the 2600K almost 6 years ago.
Yeah. My 4690K with the Hyper 212 pretty much topped out at around 4.5. Like, I just kept it at 4.4 for everyday use, and it was fine.
Yeah, that's what I did with my 2600K. I most of the time left it at 4.4.
and it ran great. But then I started noticing some choppiness in some games at 1080p, and I was playing some AAA titles and realized, oh, these work better on 6 cores. Okay, or 6 threads. Time to upgrade.
Indeed. Apparently, we're not the only ones needing an upgrade because, well, I think everyone experienced the YouTube outage that was basically worldwide for more than an hour.
Really?
When was that?
So on Tuesday, that would have been, if you're watching this month later, on October the 16th, excuse me, 2018, around 6:15 p.m. Pacific time, there was a prolonged outage on YouTube, lasting anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on where in the world you were.
I was probably driving home. That's why it didn't even faze me.
I was going to say, yeah, at that particular time, I was streaming to Twitch on the CFG channel, so I did not even notice.
I was listening to a 6 o'clock radio program. That's what it was.
So it's really unusual for a site as big as YouTube to experience downtime of any kind, and it kind of it's kind of funny, you know. If Netflix is down, nobody panics. If Facebook is down for a few minutes, people panic a little, but YouTube goes down for 15 minutes and everybody freaks out.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say YouTube's probably got a much wider audience.
It seems to me it's almost like the internet goes out. What do I do? What do I do? From a viewer perspective, I can imagine that you'd be frustrated on the content creator perspective, because especially if they're wanting people to watch their latest video at that time and it's out, then that's also jeopardizing maybe, I guess, an hour of revenue, people not watching their video.
Yeah, I would feel bad for any creators who uploaded during or before that time. Because let's face it, most of your initial views happen in that first hour or two after you upload a video.
And that there's people who, mostly everybody who's content creator, says, check that bell for notifications so you can watch the video as soon as I post it. Doesn't matter if you're driving or not, or dying.
Yep. Got to make sure you catch all those latest YouTube videos.
Shove it down your throat.
Still, I would be curious to know what exactly led to that particular outage.
Yeah, me too. Oh, so here's an article on ABC News. Pakistan causes YouTube outage for 2/3 of the world.
Oh, so they were able to determine it was caused by...
Pakistan government to block access domestically affected other countries.
Oh, really? Now that's interesting.
I wonder if it was like a... I don't know if you could DDoS a whole world, or DDoS... I don't know if DDoS would do that, but it doesn't say how they did it. They just blocked access to YouTube.com.
Well, I'd be curious to know exactly what led to that cascade of failures. to do something like that, because if the Pakistani government attempted to cut off access to YouTube domestically, and that somehow managed to cut off YouTube access to literally everybody, that's kind of scary.
Were they attacking YouTube?
No, it sounds like they were just trying to block it locally.
Oh. Interesting.
Because of anti-Islamic movies on the video sharing site, which is on. So, because of anti-Islamic movies on YouTube, they want to block it. I guess somehow it. I would want to know how specifically they try to block it. Because if you try to block it domestically and affect it locally, that's insane.
So, according to ABC News, apparently a Pakistani telecommunications company accidentally identified itself to internet computers as the world's fastest route to YouTube, but instead of serving up videos, it sent the traffic into oblivion.
It's a great word. Oblivion.
And that, combined with the fact that the Pakistani Telecommunications Authority had ordered 70 of its internet service providers to block access to YouTube due to anti-Islamic videos, is what led to the problem.
Gotcha.
Anyway, that's fascinating. Let's see. Yes. So back to hardware news. Samsung is apparently bringing its 7-nanometer 7LPP process online. They've started production of their 7-nanometer low power plus process, which is the first in the world to use EUV lithography. So EUV stands for extreme ultraviolet. And extreme ultraviolet lithography is a new process that is supposed to have a number of advantages over traditional UV lithography. In particular, it enables the use of a single mask, whereas traditional methods required up to 4 masks to achieve the same effect.
Basically, a more efficient process.
And so Samsung claims this will lower complexity and increase yields.
Better quality. Interesting. 50% lower power consumption compared to 10 nanometer. Nice. Well, as a lot of the bigger global fabs are moving towards 7-nanometer production, I'm pretty sure they all have at this point. We'll start seeing more articles like this. We're going to have flash memory at 7-nanometer soon. If they're talking about an LPP process, that's basically translating directly into memory, and probably other types of silicon as well.
Probably also some mobile CPUs as well, if it's a low power process.
So we're going to see lots of 7-nanometer products over the next year.
And speaking of 7-nanometer, this next segment I'm calling Good AMD, Bad AMD. because we have a couple of good things about AMD and a couple of bad things. So the first good thing is related to the 7 nanometer we just talked about, in that there has been a rumor leaked by the official Twitter feed of the Bits and Chips forum that AMD's Zen 2 architecture on the 7 nanometer process could feature up to a 13% IPC improvement over Zen Plus.
That's pretty exciting news, actually.
Yeah.
So, yeah, 13% at first doesn't sound like that big a jump. But the last time we had a jump this big was when we went from Nihilum, which was the last of the first-gen Core i series, like the Core i7 875K, to Sandy Bridge.
Which a lot of people are still using.
Yeah, the jump from Nihilum to Sandy Bridge was roughly 18% IPC gain. Now, the jump from Ivy Bridge to Haswell was close. It was about 11%. But since then, it's usually been on the order of 4 to 7% for every generation since then. From Intel, anyway.
Well, 7's probably pretty high. I'd say 3 to 5, probably.
I'm just going off benchmarks from... excuse me.
You okay?
Yeah, I think so. But I was going off benchmarks from Hot Hardware, and theirs were a couple of years old. For example, their most recently tested was from the Kaby Lake generation. So they didn't even... when that particular test was done, I think it was 2016, there weren't any... Or no, if it was Kaby Lake, it had to be 2017. So there was no Coffee Lake yet when those tests were done.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point being, a 13% increase in IPC from generation to generation is impressive.
It's huge. I think that's mostly from the process node jump. From 12 to 7, that's a huge, huge increase.
And, you know, yes, there was a much larger jump when going from FX to Ryzen. I think they said there was something on the order of like 47 or almost 50% increase. But there was a 5-year gap between FX and Ryzen. So
yeah, between Pile Driver and Ryzen first gen.
Exactly. So, but if we see between a 10 and 15% IPC gain for Ryzen 3, we could see an increase in performance. Of course, IPC and clock speed don't necessarily scale linearly.
True.
But
it depends greatly on the workload.
Right. But even if we take the low end at 10%, current Ryzen 2 on the Zen Plus process taps out at about 4.2 gigahertz. Well, you throw another 10% on top of that, suddenly you're talking about 4.5, 4.6.
Yeah, if not slightly higher than that. 4.7, 4.8, maybe?
Yeah, that's starting to sound an awful lot like, Coffee Lake territory.
Yep.
So
I'd be very... If they could get 4.8, I don't know. I'd be seriously thinking about that.
Well, there's already been rumors that the early engineering samples for Zen 2 were hitting 4.5 gigahertz in the lab, which would be perfectly in line with a 10 to 15% increase in IPC.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're hitting 4.5 gigahertz in the lab with early samples, then we could see potentially higher clock speeds and even greater IPC gains by the time it actually hits the market.
Well, 20% is actually a possibility. You know, over Zen 2 or Zen Plus versus Zen 2. I think
Probably on the
20%
high
is a
end, but yeah, it's
possibility.
possible.
Yeah. Well, so beyond clock speed, they're going to have other optimizations as well. You know, they're probably going to have a more optimized Infinity Fabric, probably some other latency reduction in cache.
Right.
And we still don't know if there's going to be more cores and threads, if there's going to be more cache. Those are possible as well.
Well, what we do know from the information that's been put out previously is most of the information that's currently out there, which again is mostly rumors, so take it with a grain of salt, is that they're going to stick with the 8-core, 16-thread SKU for the mainstream as the top end.
Okay. Which that's a good round number.
And if that's the case, and it would make sense because, you know, their Zeppelin dies have 4 cores apiece.
Mm-hmm.
With a CCX between them, that gets you 8 cores, 16 threads. Or I say CCX. With the Infinity Fabric between a pair of CCXs. Is what I meant.
Right.
If they're able to get that up to 4.5 gigahertz, then yeah, I think Intel's going to have a much bigger problem on their hands than they thought. Because if the 9900K is only performing 12% faster right now than the 2700X, which is Zen Plus, then with a 10 to 15% IPC increase for Zen 2, Ryzen 3, then we could see the Ryzen chips pulling ahead of their Intel counterparts for the first time.
Yep. Or at least complete parity. You know? That would be very interesting. I still would think the Coffee Lake parts might clock higher, but I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. I have no idea what to expect, honestly.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to what instruction sets AMD decides to support with Zen 2 and whether Intel has some ace up its sleeve.
I think there's one thing that we can probably have, I don't want to say faith in, but based on pricing of the last 2 generations of Ryzen, I want to say they will be priced better from a value perspective than the Intel parts.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. AMD knows that they can extract the most value out of the market right now and extract as much of the market share as they can get by being the better value option.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know what their numbers for October are like, but in September or August, they sold twice as many. So
yeah, I think that was from that data was from a European e-tailer, but it was rather suspicious about that it didn't say which European e-tailer.
Oh, okay.
And what we do know is that said European e-tailer is one of the premier e-tailers in the tech space. That's all that was said about it.
Interesting. Well, you know that they're selling really well, and there's no stock issues at the present.
Right.
They're able to keep up with demand, and
Ryzen CPUs consistently appear in the top 10 and sometimes even the top 2 or 3 on Amazon and Newegg and bunches of other places. Because right now, Intel is having supply problems. They're not able to crank out enough to meet demand. And so AMD is picking up their slack.
Well, from a gaming perspective, the 2600 part or the 2600X part is pretty interesting. On some older titles, I've seen it clock as high as 4.3 to 4.4. I've not seen my 2700X clock that high.
Speaking of higher clocks, this one's coming from notebookcheck.net. But this one, I originally had a different article for this one because this one shows a bit of negative spin, but it also had the most information about the actual leak. So there have been rumors, and there has now appeared in the 3D Mark Time Spy database an RX 590 as a new Radeon GPU. Now, the specific leak comes from a renowned leaker and someone who we've referred to in the past, Toom Apisak. It is a Time Spy result using a, quote, generic VGA, but that in the driver identifies itself as Radeon RX 590.
Interesting.
And so what this shows, apparently, in graphics score, this RX 590 is showing specs very similar to the RX 580, but it is consistently showing an increase of between 7 and 10% in performance. And some have speculated that what this is the RX 590 or RX 580 built on a 12 nanometer process.
So if that's a generic Time Spy score, that's interesting. 4759.
And the score that it received in Time Spy is pretty much in line with what you would expect. It scored a 5028, which is about a 7% increase over the RX 580 score when overclocked of 4679, and about 10% over the RX 580 at stock. And so this particular database entry shows the RX 590 to have a 1,545 megahertz base clock, which is a significant bump because that's actually 205 megahertz higher than the RX 580's boost clock. And so as an RX 480 owner, the RX 580 is basically an overclocked RX 480 with a few architectural improvements.
Right.
Basically,
what's the boost on your 480?
Let me pop open GPU-Z and check. Mm-hmm.
Thought I had GPU-Z installed. I guess I don't.
Let's see. So right now, I'm mostly idling at the desktop. But right now, I'm running at about 1077 megahertz. But it'll boost up to 1261.
Ah, okay. Have you tried overclocking it?
I've considered it, but since I'm running a pair of them,
Oh, right. You might have instability.
yeah, I don't want to. I don't want to. I don't want to engender any instability in the actual runs. I don't want to introduce potential overheating problems. If I was going to do it, I would almost certainly have to undervolt them first.
Right.
Which generally results in better results anyway from them. But I have tinkered around a little bit in the Radeon Adrenaline utility. And
what, man?
And there's some headroom there. I've, just increasing the power target a little bit. I've had them boost up to over 1300, but it's a struggle sometimes to get them there. I think technically the maximum boost clock is something like 1411 if you crank the power target, but it does not stay there long.
Oh, is that because of heat? It thermal throttles a bit.
Yeah, Polaris is a very efficient architecture until you start really cranking the clocks.
Gotcha.
Which is part of the reason why the RX 580 drew so much more power than the RX 480. The RX 480 is rated, I think, at a 175 watt part, whereas the RX 580, even though it's basically the exact same part, is something like a 225 watt part.
Is it really? That sounds kind of high.
Wait, you're right. I think I have the wrong figures for that. It may be. I remember there is a significant step up because it's like 150, 175, or 175, 200. Let me check.
Yeah, I'm looking too because I want to say 185 watt TDP.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas the RX 480.
I want to say the 480 was around 160.
Yeah. I knew there was a. So its rated TDP is 150, but it averages around 160.
Okay. GTX 1070 Ti is a 180, but I've seen it consume right around 200 to 220, and I've seen my Vega 56 consume around 300. But I've also got that heavily modified.
Right.
It's boosting up to 1622 right now, so which is, yeah, it's a lot higher than stock Vega 56.
So, I mean, I'm thinking about this. I'm trying to think about this logically. The move from 14 nanometer to 12 nanometer is not a huge jump from a process node standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently it's enough to enable this up to 10% increase in speed while maintaining a similar power profile. Because honestly, the RX 580 pretty much tapped out the overhead that Polaris in its 14 nanometer form had.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently the 12 nanometer process gives it about 10% more headroom that they're able to push the clock that much higher.
Well, it's a good part. It's a good architecture for what it is. I mean,
yeah,
it's a solid
mid-range GPU.
Mm-hmm. The reason they sell really well.
And, you know, actually, I should have included this in the hardware deals, because right now you can get an MSI Armor RX 570 4 gig, which is just a slightly detuned version of the RX 580, for $160, and you get 3 free games with it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's a steal.
The only downside is the armor cooling is, I've heard, is not that great.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, it's a budget part.
Yeah. But said that's the 8 gig version?
4.
4 gig, okay, yeah.
Do they make an 8 gig? I thought they only had 4 gig version.
Take it back. It actually is the 8 gig version of the 570.
Well, they do make an 8. I didn't know that.
Yep.
Not that you'd really have any issues with texture memory at 1080p. It is nice to have that extra frame buffer, though.
Yeah, and the RX 570 and 580 are, I can tell you from experience, are fully capable of doing entry-level 1440p. My RX 480s, they're able to upscale to 1440p without a whole lot of issue.
Well, it's kind of what they're known for. 1440p at medium setting.
Anyway, RX 590, if this is the Polaris 30 that we've been hearing all the rumors about, then you know what? I think it's probably a solid part. I hope AMD takes it and runs with it.
I'm looking forward to seeing more press about it. There's been nothing other than rumor.
I mean, if they're willing to put out an RX 590 part for the right before the holiday season that squeezes a little bit more out of Polaris, and they're able to offer it at a price comparative to the RX 580, and then maybe see some of the RX 580 prices come down even more, especially considering, like I said, how low RX 570 prices are right now. Yeah, I think that could be a winner.
Oh yeah, man. It'd be a huge upgrade for someone that's got a, pre-Pascal or a pre RX 480 or Polaris part. It'd be a nice huge upgrade for him.
Yeah, considering the RX 570, 580 have superior performance to, say, the R9 390 at around half the power consumption.
Yeah. And slightly better than a GTX 980.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still lots of people rocking those cards.
But not all is sunshine and rainbows in the land of AMD. AMD has... I don't understand why they continue to do this. In China, they have released a new RX 580 2048 SP. Now, if that 2048 number sounds familiar, it's because that's the number of stream processors in the RX 570. And so essentially what AMD has done is they have silently launched a new RX 580 2048 SP, which is basically a rebrand of that same RX 578 gigabyte we were talking about a minute ago. Which...
I wonder why.
I asked the same thing.
Does it say, and I wonder, I'd like to see pics of the actual GPU. I wonder if it actually says RX 580 on the GPU, or if it doesn't say 570.
That's a good question. Apparently, the Sapphire model that Tom's Hardware got a look at has a factory overclock of 1306 megahertz on the boost clock, which is 22 megahertz higher than AMD's reference. This model will come with 4 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory clocked at 7,000 megahertz effective on a 256-bit bus, which again sounds very familiar if you're familiar with the RX 570, because that's basically its specs.
So it's clocked a gigahertz lower than other 580s. The memory is. I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt here, but I don't see any reason this should be a 580.
Yeah,
it looks like it. I mean, it looks like it would be more accurate to call it a 570 OC.
Yeah, because that's essentially what it is. Because I'm looking here, I'm taking a look at this again, this MSI Radeon RX 570 Armor that I was talking about for 160. The core clock on it is 1268 megahertz. So this is overclocked to 1306. That's what? About 40 megahertz higher?
Sounds about right.
The RX 570 has the same 7,000 megahertz effective on a 256-bit bus.
Oh. So they did the same thing last year with the 560.
Yeah, there was a whole fiasco about that where you had 2 different 560s. One with 896 stream processors and one with 1024.
Yep. I forgot about that. And it was launched in China and did make it over here.
Right. And so there was a while you had to check and see if you were going to get a 560, which 560 you're actually getting. And so at least this time, they had the foresight to name it RX 580 2048 SP.
Well, at least they're doing that. I just don't agree with calling it an RX 580.
I don't either. Apparently, the idea here is that it's supposed to be a 150-watt part, which, again, totally in line with the RX 570. Why they decided to call it the RX 580 2048 SP, it doesn't make any sense to me.
If you want a 150-watt part, get a GTX 1070 or 1066 gig or a 570.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole thing just makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's all cool in the gang, man. If you've got a 400 or 450-watt power supply, you know, and you need a 150-watt TDP part, then don't get a 580 or a 480. Get something that fits the power bill, you know? I don't agree with these kinds of moves, man. Because
yeah, it just strikes me as it's a marketing gimmick, but it's a scummy marketing gimmick.
Yeah. Is this a rebrand though?
Yeah, it's essentially a rebrand of the RX 570 8 gig. Or not even the 8 gig, just as the RX 570 as RX 580 2048 SP.
Don't agree with it.
Especially considering the regular RX 580 has 2,304 stream processors.
And it's clocked higher.
Yep.
Not only on the GPU, but the memory. The memory here referenced in the article is clocked at 7,000 megahertz. RX 580 memory is 8,000. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely marketing scheme to
Right.
get people to buy it.
And I don't know if it's true or not, but some have said that the 580 seems to be memory constrained slightly anyway. So, having a gigahertz lower in clock speed. Yeah. Yeah. That's a naughty thing.
Anyway.
Rebranding sounds like an awesome thing to do. You'll never have to get a new card. You just keep slightly upclocking the existing cards and call it something else.
Well, rebranding is not always a bad thing. Like when Nvidia was going from the GTX 600 series to the 700 series, basically all those parts were essentially rebranded. You know, so like the previous gen 680 was now the GTX 770, clocked slightly higher, and they probably did some sort of slight optimizations to it. It was a solid part, you know,
Yeah.
but I don't think all rebrands are necessarily bad if they're done correctly. But
I mean, neither side is immune to this kind of thing.
Yeah.
NVIDIA was infamous for the way that they took their G92 silicon that they used for the 8800 GT and rebranded that about 3 or 4 different times. First is the 8800 GT, then the 9800 GT, then the 9800 GX, and then finally is the GTS 250.
Mm.
Which I own 2 of those. I had a 9800 GT and I had a GTS 250.
Pretty much the same GPU?
Pretty much the same GPU. The GTS 250 clocked slightly higher.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't get it. I guess that's probably okay, considering it's a 250. But this whole game with some of these have DDR5, DDR4, DDR3 with the same model number. You know, some of these have a gimped GPU versus the rest of the product line, and they're still the same model number. Like, I just think that's really deceptive bad practice.
Yeah, like I said, none of them are immune. NVIDIA's done it even more recently with the GT 1030. You know, they had the whole debacle with the DDR4 variant that basically had a quarter of the performance of the original part.
5 gigabyte 1060.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, the 3 gigabyte 1060 also was kind of that thing. I still don't know what to think of it. It should have really been the 1050 Ti, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
And then what we got is the 1050 Ti really should have been the 1050. And then what was sold as the 1050 should have been sold as a 1040. But that's just my 2 cents.
The 1050 Ti is a 4 gig card, and the 1060 3 gig, of course, a 3 gig card. So that'd be weird for 1050 Ti 3 gig, 1050 4 gig. Renaming them.
Right, but the GTX 1050 Ti also had 2 gig variants.
Did it?
the 1050 is a 2 gig card, but you go looking around the parts and you'll find there were GTX 1050s that had 4 gigs, and there were GTX 1050 Ti's that only had 2. When you put in when you put it in AIB partner hands, weird things happen.
Yeah, true.
Which actually explains the way NVIDIA has acted when it comes to the RTX launch, which is kind of the big topic for the evening. One I wanted to make sure to cover. Probably the biggest tech news of this week is that the RTX 2070 was launched this week. And a lot of the tech press gave a big, solid meh to the card.
Big, solid meh. I love that. Well, you can kind of understand. I mean, it's the first RTX, or it's the first Turing-based card that they've released, which is almost a recommendation.
Right. It's I included a non-text article because I think their title really says it all. NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2070 Founders Edition Review. Mid-range Turing, high-end price.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really think that puts in a nutshell what the problem is for RTX right now.
It's the price, mainly. Yeah, you can argue for days about not having any supported features and software based on the new feature set, but it's mainly price. The 2070 is near parity with the 1080. It does slightly outperform it from what I've seen, but it's also priced slightly higher if you're looking at bargain bin 2070s, like the $500 variants.
And they're the ones with the crummy blower coolers.
Yeah, there's some with some custom AIB, but they're very low end compared to the $550 and the $600 variants.
Mm-hmm.
But that card is not a $600 part. So, I mean, what's his name from PC? Was it PC World?
Yeah.
Said it right. Like, if you have $500 to spend and you've got it in your head, you're going to spend $500 on a video card. That's the one to get. But if you're a bargain shopper, then don't get it. Potentially.
Yeah, I think he said that about the RTX 2070 XC from EVGA.
Which is one of the $500 parts, I think.
Well, $550, but...
Oh, okay.
But yeah, when it comes down to it, you know, I included in the links in the description below a number of different reviews. I mentioned a non-text review just because I think their description is probably one of the better ones. I actually included 2 from PC World, both by Brett Chacos.
Oh, yeah, that's his name. I really like him.
I included the Founders Edition review just for comparison to the other Founder Editions reviews, as well as the one for the EVGA RTX 2070 XC, which is $50 less than the Founders Edition, but actually gives superior performance because it's a better cooler.
Mm-hmm.
I also linked the one from TechSpot because TechSpot is written by Steve and Tim from Hardware Unboxed. In fact, Hardware Unboxed is TechSpot's video channel.
Oh, nice.
I didn't discover that until a few months ago, but
which I do largely agree with a lot of their observations.
And so, Hardware Unboxed, I included a link as well to their 20-game benchmark where they show how the RTX 2070 on launch day compares to GTX 1070, 1070 Ti, 1080, Vega 56, Vega 64, and so on and so forth up the stack. And basically, right now, the 2070 is a more expensive 1080 until RTX becomes a thing.
Well, and there's no way to quantify what kind of performance you're going to get from the new feature set. There's no software out.
Exactly. You know, that's the huge problem is right now with the RTX series, you are paying for promises, literally.
Yeah. You shouldn't be doing that, not with tech. That's not why you get tech. You get tech to do a specific job or to do something, not for promises.
I mean, I think all of us can remember when a particular technology was supposed to be the next big thing. The Glide API, Mantle from AMD,
Mm-hmm.
PhysX from NVIDIA in the late 2000s.
And none of those really caught on. And Mantle went on to become Vulkan, right?
Right.
Which that's getting more utilization in some game engines, but
yeah, in particular, as a significant portion of the open source community is starting to look at Vulkan, basically as a replacement for OpenGL.
Well, it's a good replacement for it. It's a very solid API. Very good at leveraging compute.
Let's see. I mean, there's a lot of things we could talk about with the RTX 2070.
Yeah, but I don't know.
I mean, it's really hard to say anything new about it because pretty much everything that can be said about it right now is it's a slightly more expensive 1080. It performs about the same as the 1080. It's supposed to have all these features that haven't been implemented yet. And it's a worse value for your dollar right now versus its predecessor.
Yeah. It's meh. That's exactly what it is. It's meh. Because it's a decent part, but it's way overpriced. If we were talking about this at $400, okay. But the fact that 1070 Ti exists at 400 to 450, the fact that 1080 exists at 420 to 500, you can take a 1070 Ti, overclock it, and you've got 1080 performance.
Yep.
And there's so many great 1080 parts out there, and you can find deals almost daily. I'm not sure.
Still the price goes down of the 20 series and stuff, unless you have to have ray tracing. But at that point, why not be a big shot and get a Quadro?
I mean,
Quadro do ray tracing?
Yes, the new Quadro RTX series are ray tracing capable. They They, of course, have the full-fat RT cores. But remember, even a baseline Quadro is going to cost you significantly more than anything in the RTX 20 series.
Yeah.
But if you're a professional creator and you absolutely need that tech, then you should probably be buying those anyway.
Yeah.
Well, I guess professional person could probably buy an RTX 2080 Ti or 2080 if they need the ray tracing and high render if it's adequate enough. I'm in three three PC building Facebook groups, and I have actually seen people doubting, look at what I did. I just bought the 2080. The 2080, and then somebody says, I just bought the 2080 Ti. Good for you. In my opinion, price is the problem. That's my response. Another person said, what do I do if I want to buy a 2080? I'm like, sell your car, buy it. That's pretty much what you have to do, in my opinion. I was joking, of course.
You know, actually, I'm looking at Vega prices. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Hunter. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I was joking. I was jokingly saying sell your car and buy a video card. Might also been my joke on the i9 9900K. But anyways.
So I'm looking at Vega prices. Vega's viable now. Vega's viable again.
Yeah, you can get a Vega 56 for right around $400.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, it comes with that same free 3-game pack that RX 570 we talked about earlier did. So you're getting $150 worth of games on top of it.
And I heard good things about Strange Brigade, even though I never heard of the game.
Yeah, the 3 games that it comes with are Strange Brigade, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and Star Control Origins.
Nice.
And so, yeah, I'm looking here on Newegg. You can buy a Power Color Red Dragon RX Vega 56 for $369 after $30 rebate. So for $370, you can have a Vega 56, or if you want, a slightly more prestigious name, you can get a Sapphire Pulse RX Vega 56 for $399 plus $499 shipping. So for $405, you can have a Sapphire Vega card shipped to your door.
Oh, the 56 Nano is back. Oh, I wish they would have had those around when I bought this one.
Yeah, and even it is only $429.
Oh, something I found out. Power Color made I guess a mini ITX version of the 1070 Ti, I believe.
Nice.
Yeah, they use the same cooler, if I remember correctly.
The Zotac mini parts aren't bad either. Although BuildZoid doesn't like the VRMs that are on them, but I haven't had any issues with the 1070 Ti Mini in the backup build.
Well, the reason Zotac's able to hit the price points it does is because it has to make cuts somewhere.
Yeah, it skimps on VRM. I'm not going to lie. But
Power Color has a mini ITX version of the RX Vega.
Yeah, they've got the 56 Nano.
Yeah.
That's such a cool looking part. It looks like one of those 1050s with a single fan on it.
Right?
but it's a high-end part. Well, I consider it a high-end part.
I mean, it's 1070 equivalent. Not so much for core clock, but
Yeah, I remember wanting to get my hands on an R9 Fury Nano so bad.
Those look like really cool parts, man. Those little R9 Furies.
was that the liquid cooled one?
Uh-uh. It looks just like the Vega 56 Nano.
Okay.
Yeah, the Fury X was the liquid cooled one, and unfortunately, the Fury series doesn't hold up quite as well as some of the others. Mostly because it was limited to the 4 gigabytes due to its use of HBM1 memory.
Yeah. These Vega parts will hold up a lot better over time with the 8 gig frame buffer. Oh, I want to water cool mine so bad. Sorry to get off topic.
No, it's fine. Anyway, to wrap up on RTX 2070, coming back to Hardware Unboxed, they did, the day we're recording this, October the 18th, 2018, they released a video called NVIDIA RTX 1 month later. It's still a huge mess.
Yeah.
And I don't know any other way to say it than that. The whole RTX launch to me comes across as rushed and disorganized.
Yeah, it is. And way overpriced. Actually, you know, come to think of it, when you look at their entire product stack, it's way overcrowded. Way overcrowded. What do they have? Different, like 15 different parts right now?
Yep. I mean, let's think it through. NVIDIA right now has entry-level GT 1030.
Mm-hmm.
Then the GTX 1050, 1050 Ti, the GeForce GTX 1063 gig, GTX 1066 gig, GTX 1070, GTX 1070 Ti, GTX 1080, GTX 1080 Ti, GTX Titan XP, and all its variants.
Little P.
Yeah. Then you have the RTX 2070, which is supposed to slot in roughly right alongside the GTX 1080.
That's
The
11.
RTX 2080, which slots in at the 1080 Ti level. And then the RTX 2080 Ti, which slots in at the Titan XP level.
13.
And that doesn't even count variants or, you know, even begin to talk about the fact that within those products there is a wide amount of variance.
13.
But there's no 2060, 2050, 2050 Ti.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah.
13 or 14 different parts.
I'm waiting to see if they make a 2060.
They will. They'll round out the product line, I'm sure.
I'm hoping that they just make a 2060 6 gig and not make the 2063 gig. And if they just make the 2050 Ti and not make the 2050.
I'm not sure what they'll do. I'm fairly certain it'll be probably released around $400 though.
Oh yeah, makes it so affordable that, and it's not going to have ray tracing, of course.
Yeah.
It's just going to be the GTX level.
Well, it's not released. Probably won't have ray tracing.
Yeah.
$400. That's 13 different products, man.
And then that makes it to where, yeah, the 2060 is really not affordable, so we'll just stick with the 10 series until the 20 series drops in price.
Now, what about AMD? 5 or 6?
Well, let's see. And I'll include all the variants because there are a number of variants when it comes to AMD. If you don't include any previous generation in the stack, you have the RX 550. You have the RX 560, 896, and 1024. I consider those two different products, but they're still RX 560s.
Okay.
You have the RX 570, which does come in 4 gig and 8 gig variants, but they're still the same GPU. You have the RX 580, which also comes in 4 gig and 8 gig variants. You have the new RX 580 2048 SP, which is really just a rebadged RX 570. And then past that, you have RX Vega 56 and RX Vega 64. So if you include all the variants there, that's 10. If you don't, it's 7.
Well, then there are some other variants of the Pascal lineup that weren't included, like the variations of the 1030, the 1060, 5 gig. So
either way, NVIDIA has the far more crowded product stacked.
Yeah, that's just, it seems very sloppy.
Yeah.
Well, what strikes me is it seems like NVIDIA has been resting on their laurels of sorts. You know, they know that they are utterly dominant in the market, and so basically all they've had to do for the entire last GPU generation is whenever AMD released anything that's the slightest bit of a threat, they just throw out a reactionary part.
Yeah.
Oh, the RX 570 is performing really close to a GTX 1066 gig. Let's throw out a GTX 3 gig part.
Well, the problem is they haven't competed on the high end. They have to compete on the high end. Because that... And yeah, they're competing well in the mid-range, but they can only do that for so long. They need to make headlines, you know? Because if they have the fastest part, even if it's only for a month or two, that's going to drive sales of the rest of the lineup. And if they're able to compete with NVIDIA at the high end, I'm talking 80 Ti, that's where they need to be. Or at least close. Because if they go for a while without being on the high end, they'll have something similar happen to them in the video card market that happened to them with FX and PileDrive. It's all about appearance, perception, because it's the high end stuff that drives marketing and advertising.
Well, and this is a problem AMD has had for a while. Basically, their whole strategy since the late 2000s has been what's called sweet spot marketing. Their idea was they would claw back their portion of the market by targeting the sweet spots where most people spent most of their money, which was the budget and the mid-range. And
well, I kind of agree with that, but they've had some high-end parts. They've had like the 7970 and some of those variants. They've had the R9 parts, you know. What, 4890? Of course, I can't remember. That's way back.
Well, you always had to have that Halo product. That's not what I'm saying. AMD has focused most of their marketing efforts and most of their gaming GPU prowess at the mid-range because they know that's where most people spend most of the money.
Right.
It's why they're so heavily invested in pushing RX 570, RX 580. And that strategy's worked for a long time. I mean, if you go and look, although they weren't as popular as their NVIDIA equivalents, the mid-range GPUs since the Radeon 4000 series have been among the most popular in the Steam hardware surveys at various times, from the RT 4870 to the 5850, the 6850 and 6870, the 7800 series, which later became the R9 270 and 270X. I mean, those GPUs have sold well time and time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping what's going to happen going forward for AMD is they're going to take some of that Ryzen money and some of that Ryzen know-how and bring it over to their GPU house.
Well, there's some aspects of that. So some of the leaked architecture design diagrams for Navi are showing, I don't know if you call it chiplets or not, but it seems like the design's almost modular in a way.
Right.
And they're connected through Infinity Fabric. So I think some of that design philosophy is making its way into Navi. But we won't know until we actually see some gaming parts.
Right.
Just really starved for new AMD tech.
Yeah, and until NVIDIA's tech can either come down in price or, you know, actually show something interesting, yeah, we're just kind of stuck in a cycle of meh.
Yeah, and it kind of breaks my heart a bit being a tech enthusiast. I like NVIDIA parts. I don't like NVIDIA's culture. They're kind of very cutthroat, but I do like their tech, and I just hate to see these interesting RTX parts at these price points. But I guess, what do they do with their Pascal stock? You know what I mean?
Yeah, they got to sell it.
And maybe that's why they've priced the RTX parts as high as they have. I can't see rational buyers wanting to buy into the RTX stuff yet, because there's beyond 4K at ultra high frame rate. That's the only use case I can see for RTX that's like bona fide use case. Beyond that, it's really hard for me to recommend 2080 or 2070 to somebody, because between the $400 and $500 price point right now, you've got some really good parts in there that you can make a case for. Or even let's take $380 up to $500. You can make a case for 1070, 1070 Ti. I mean, all of those parts, even Vega 56, and maybe even Vega 64. Like, you can make good arguments for any of those parts, but 2070 is the closest to where you can make a bona fide argument for it, and that's because of the fact that you can get those at $500. But then the prices go up to $550 and $600, sometimes a little higher. They're just priced way too high, man. I can't make a case. I just can't.
Yeah, it's really hard to right now.
Yeah, I mean, someone comes to me and says, "Okay, I want to spend $2,500 on and get great 1440p or 4K performance." Okay, well, then we start looking at either i7 or Ryzen 7.
Mm-hmm.
and then we start looking at 1080 or 1080 Ti.
Yep.
That's right where I start looking at that price point. Beyond that, well, I can't make a case for anything else.
All right. Well, we already kind of brushed against one of our hardware deals for this week, the RX 570 8 gig. It is an MSI Armor card, so it's not the greatest cooler in the world, but it's perfectly serviceable. And $160 after rebate with 3 free games, I don't think you'll be complaining.
Oh yeah.
Solid 1080p performance, entry level 1440p at medium. Our other hardware deal for this week is on an ADATA XPG SX6000 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD. It comes with a do-it-yourself heatsink kit, and it is a 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD for only $93.
That's a good price. Not as fast as other NVMe drives, but it's still faster than regular hard drives. Much faster.
Oh yeah,
Well, let's go ahead.
Yeah, 1,000 megabytes per second writes and 800 megabytes per second reads. Or sorry, I said that backwards. 1,000 megabytes per second reads and 800 megabytes per second writes for $93 is nothing to sneeze at.
Well, then at that price point, it's starting to rub up against some of the more high-end SATA-based SSDs, like the 870 or 860 Evo.
Right, but those are bandwidth limited by SATA 3, and they're going to top out about 575, 580 megabytes per second.
Actually, I thought that the data 3 was what I've seen is 560. Is it 570, 580 the highest, or is it 560?
It's around there, 560 somewhere. I don't know.
I think the maximum theoretical is like 570, 580, but I've never seen one rated much faster than about 560, 565.
Yeah. It has the up to speed.
And even though this SX6000 is a slower NVMe drive, it's still almost twice as fast as a SATA SSD.
Yeah.
Well, that's in bandwidth, though. That's not...
right. Not in day-to-day operations.
Right. But that's a great price. I mean, for budget NVMe.
Yeah.
Plus, it's that's a name brand. So a lot of people use XPG parts.
Yeah. Actually, several years ago, I built my brother a desktop PC. Fairly basic, but for the boot drive, I used an ADATA S55 120 gig. That's still kicking strong about 6 years later.
There you go. Nice.
So, yep, couple of good hardware deals this week. Well, gentlemen, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I pretty much covered everything I could think of. And then some, actually.
If y'all are not aware of Newegg deals, email deals, make an account over there. I would probably not suggest adding your credit card and keeping it there. Just use it temporarily because of the recent hack. But they have weekly some that are percentages off, but I'm in the email deals, and I also have Shell Shocker daily deals and other deals that are, and then also Newegg TV is every Thursday, and they have Thursday only deals. So it's a lot of savings that you can do with Newegg.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me once again this week. I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for tuning in to watch us. If you've enjoyed this content, you can find much more here on our YouTube channel. If you want to see past episodes of TechForge, we have a playlist that you can watch through us as we discuss tech. If you want to find other great content, you can find us on Twitch at twitch.tv/CrossForgeGaming, as well as several other places on social media, Facebook, Twitter, all the usual suspects and places. You can also check out our Discord server. We have a lively community over there, along with several communities around a number of games. I know Jason, Jimmy Bones, and I, we play a lot of World of Warships. So if you want to get on that. If you're watching this the day it goes live, we're going to be having an Overwatch community game night in the near future. So,
oh, cool.
Regardless, we're glad just to have you watch us. We hope you've enjoyed us rambling on about tech. I've been Dynamo Ned. This has been TechForge. And remember, when life has you down, Jesus loves you, and to forge on.